I am Will, and I am alone. I assume that you have all been reading the updates that have gotten posted to the internet through various sites, so I won't bore you with repeating what you already know. But I will tell you the true beginning. 1 month ago, my social studies teacher assigned us an essay on the Native American tribes in our state. During my research, I found a fascination with their legends. So once I had turned in the essay, I went looking in the local library to learn more about these tribes' stories. Yes, I know, you all must be thinking, nerd, but they really are interesting, and I might have been able to get some extra credit off of it. I'm not helping, am I? Anyways, I checked out a book called Local Legends, Tales of the Indians of Maine. Reading it at home, I realized that the author/narrator was just a complete dick who was trying to make some quick cash. So I was about to close the book and return it to the library when I saw that in the table of contents there was a section marked Monsters and Local Horrors. I became intrigued and thought that if any of them were truly scary, I could show them to my friends to get bro points. I wish that was still my biggest concern. Anyways, I skimmed through them and discovered that most of them were fairly bland, cut-and-paste stories that most native tribes have. That was until I came to a story marked The One Who Listens. Fact or fiction? That seemed like a promising story. The myth immediately fascinated me. However, I won't copy most of the text here, as I'm sure you've already seen the first 3 pages. Instead, I'll just copy the end of what you saw. Now, as I do with most of these stories, I took it with a grain of salt. However, if you look deeper, you may find that many Abenaki have in fact lost their sight hunting, and will not say how their eyes were taken from them. There are also multiple records showing hikers who ventured too far into the northern woods and were killed by some animal that blinded and, as far as the autopsy could tell, tortured them. The woman that told me the poem also gave me a scroll of old parchment containing what I can only assume is a summoning ritual. She told me, towards the end of his life, her grandfather had left with a copy of this scroll, telling her that he was going to give the last of his life so that the Abenaki could reclaim the woods for themselves. According to the woman, her grandfather was never seen again, and neither was Et Qui Audit. That was until more people came and the Abenaki were forced to move deep into the woods to preserve their way of life. I have translated and transcribed the ritual here. First, one must bind their eyes so no light can be seen. It would be best done in the dark. Then, they must recite the incantation. Bound and burned was Et Qui Audit. Blinded and beaten was Et Qui Audit. My ancestors did thee wrong, but now I summon you of my own free will. Come to me, monster, and battle we shall, so that my children may know to be quiet, or else Et Qui Audit will find you. I know I shouldn't have done it, but I'm a horror fan, and my friends and I have done a lot of rituals before. I didn't think that this one would actually work. I practiced the ritual that night, and as soon as I finished, something changed. Not the room got colder or the light seemed less powerful or some cliche bullshit like that. No, I felt something change in myself. I'm not sure how to describe it, but I could feel more. Like I suddenly had a sixth sense that boosted my others. I had an urge to look out my window towards the woods. At the time, I had assumed it was an innate fear that I had actually summoned the monster. Now, however, I know it was something else compelling me to peer through that glass. What I saw was nothing. Or, at least I thought it was nothing. I did see what looked like a small patch of fog moving towards my house from the woods. I opened the window to get a better look at what the thing was, and as the mass got closer, it began to take shape. The thing looked humanoid, thin and bony with long legs and arms. Where a face should be, I saw only a round shape with two giant protrusions on either side. When the thing reached my house, it began to reach its long arms up towards my window, and I realized that it planned to climb inside. I immediately tried slamming the window closed, but 5 bony fingers shoved themselves in between the glass and the sill. I shoved down with all of my weight, but another hand joined the first and began lifting it back open. At this point, I threw myself as far away as I could and began backing towards the door. The thing then began to pull itself into my house, and I could now see its face. The protrusions were in fact giant ears, and the thing was blind. It was then that I had realized what I'd done. Somehow I had summoned Et Qui Audit. I froze with fear. I know I should have run, and I did try, but it was like I no longer was in control of my own body. The creature finished squeezing its lanky frame through the window and began walking towards me. What do you want? I asked, terrified. Et Qui Audit then crossed the distance between us in a single step, and then pressed a long, bony finger against my lips and said with a raspy voice, I snapped my mouth shut, and tears began to leak from my eyes as I realized I was going to die. But I didn't. Instead, I heard in my mind the same raspy voice.
You have called me, and in doing so, you have issued a challenge. I thank you for this, as your limbs will give me the strength to return to my former glory.
I stood there, still, pressed against the wall. Then I realized the creature wanted me to respond. I barely got a single word out before I felt sharp nails press into my neck, hard and quick enough to draw blood.
Quiet!
It rasped again, louder this time, so I did the only thing I could think of. I tried directing my thoughts toward the creature. I don't want to fight you. Please, I didn't know what I was doing.
You knew quite well, boy. Otherwise, I would not be here.
And with that, its head, which was looking down at me, began twisting, and I felt a sudden pain in my head. I started to groan with agony, but then I felt Et Qui Audit's entire hand wrap around my throat, tightening with the more noise I made. I managed to stop the sounds emitting from my throat when my hand suddenly moved on its own, clenching into a fist. I started breathing heavier as I could feel my arms starting to move as well. My body was not my own. I was suddenly a prisoner of my own flesh. I yelled out and thrashed with both my mind and body. The hand tightened, and I could no longer breathe, but I once again had control of my own extremities. I tried to calm my panicking mind and imagined a wall, blocking me from whatever was trying to take control of my limbs. I then felt something trying to break down the barrier in my mind. I mentally screamed as loud as I could at the thing to leave me alone. I felt it thrash back, and suddenly, the hand was gone from my throat. I could breathe again. I tried chasing after the thing in my mind when I came against a barrier of its own, and the tendril that had been attacking me quickly retreated behind it. I pounded at this barrier, falling to the ground as I no longer had the will to keep myself standing. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in the hospital, and my parents were at my bedside. My father was snoring and had his arm wrapped around my, also sleeping, mother. I opened my mouth to speak, but my vocal cords wouldn't work. "Mom!" I managed to push out, but my voice was horrible. It sounded exactly like the thing, and I began hyperventilating before blacking out again. When I once again awoke, a nurse was looking down at me, and he was speaking. "It's all right, Will. It's all right. You awake? Good. Now don't try to speak. Your vocal cords have been damaged. Don't worry, they will heal within a few days. But before then, I would like to avoid making as much noise as possible. Nod if you understand me." I nodded, and he smiled before looking over at my parents and saying, "He's gonna be just fine. I'll give you some time with him." The nurse left, and my mother immediately rushed over to me and began asking questions. "Are you okay? What happened, honey? How did you get hurt? Do you need some water? What can I do?" My father reached out a hand and touched her back. "Sweetie, he can't talk," my dad said. "Oh, right," my mom said, laughing nervously. "Well, how will we communicate with him then?" "Will, you can move your hands, right?" my dad asked, and I nodded in response. "Oh, that's right. Here, Will, you can write whatever you want to say with these." My mom handed me a paper and pencil. "Do you feel well enough to answer some questions?" she asked. I once again nodded. My dad raised up my hospital bed so I was in a sitting position. "Okay," she sighed. "What happened to you, Will? When I came home, I found you passed out next to your tipped-over dresser." I grabbed the paper and was about to write what had happened when I realized if I told my parents what really happened, they wouldn't believe me. Or worse, they would think that I was crazy. I'd be put on some antipsychotics or thrown into some institution. Instead of the truth, I made up a story of how I ran into my dresser and fell to the ground before blacking out. This seemed to satisfy my parents, and they, mostly, stopped asking me questions. I was discharged from the hospital 2 days later. I went back to school the following day. The memory of my encounter with Et Qui Audit faded each day, and I started to believe that maybe I had just run into the dresser. That was until Brian was murdered. When my friends and I found his last words, I knew that I had truly summoned a monster. I thought about telling Richard what I did at lunch the next day, but then Alex crashed our table and something was different. I could feel a connection with him. It was a sort of metaphysical connection. And right then, I knew something was wrong. I'm sure you all know what happened that night. Alex broke in, chased us into the woods where Zach and Richard met their end. What you might not know is that the monster came to kill me as well. After Zach had died, I felt Et Qui Audit chasing me down. Instead of continuing to flee, though, I stopped and threw up that mental wall that had stopped it the last time. When the monster came into my vision, I saw that it had changed. Et Qui Audit was no longer a foggy silhouette. It was just as solid as you and I. But just as the monster got within reach, it stopped.
I remember you, boy.
It spoke in my mind.
You are the one who called me here, and for that, I am eternally grateful. When you summoned me, I was weak, barely a shadow. But because of you, I have now returned to my former self.
I sucked in a breath, trying to hold back a sob as my life flashed before my eyes. But before my lungs betrayed me, the monster put a finger to my lips and said,
Quiet.
And then its mouth contorted into a grin that literally stretched from ear to ear. Then Et Qui Audit vanished into the night, and I collapsed, unable to cry, unable to scream, unable to run. The next 2 weeks were the worst of my life. 2 days after Alex broke into Richard's house, Mitch killed himself by speeding his car off the nearest bridge. My parents were advised to institutionalize me, but instead, they decided to take the month off work and keep me under a constant watch. I spent most of my days in a haze of junk food, video games, and movies. No horror, though. After what had happened, I had lost my stomach for the strange and occult. Around a week after the incident, at least I think it was a week, my memory is still mostly a blur, Michael O'Reilly showed up knocking on my door. I knew his name, as one of the only things that I had been keeping track of was Et Qui Audit's murders. I saw my mother answer the door and talk with Michael before shutting it while holding up a finger as if to say, 1 minute. Then, I heard my mother knock on my door and ask if she could come in. "Honey, there's a man here who wants to borrow a book you checked out from the library. Native American Tales or something? Does that sound familiar?" I realized that he must be trying to find his daughter, although I wasn't sure that there would be much left to find. I told my mother I'd go down and meet him before I grabbed the book from under my bed. I hesitated before opening the door, though. This book contained the summoning ritual. With that, Michael could call Et Qui Audit to him, and I was sure that now that the monster had its full strength back, it would slaughter him. I then flipped through the book to find the summoning ritual and tore the pages out. The man who stood before me when I opened the door looked broken. His eyes were bloodshot, and it looked as if he hadn't shaved in a few days. Not to mention the expression on his face. It was empty, as if his whole life had been torn away from him, which I guess it had. I gave him the book, and as he was leaving, I said to him, "Don't do anything stupid, Michael." And from the look on his face, I knew that no matter what I said or did, Michael would do anything to get his daughter back. The next day, I heard that Michael had been hospitalized, and that he had found a cave where the killer was hiding. Alex isn't the only one who owned a police scanner. It was then I decided that I just couldn't wait around for the monster to kill me too. The police had been wanting to interview me since the incident, but my parents had been adamant that I needed time to process everything. So I cleaned myself up and drove down to the station. Inside was chaos. Officers were running around the place like headless chickens. It was like a hurricane of blue uniforms and white paper. But in the center of it all, like the eye of the storm, was the chief. Chief Birmingham was a tall man with dark skin and piercing blue eyes. There wasn't anything that went on in this town without him knowing about it. Well, that was until I summoned the monster. I navigated my way through the officers to the chief, and his eyes locked with mine. When I reached him, I yelled over the noise, "Hello, Chief Birmingham. Sir? I heard you have some questions for me?" The chief just nodded and said something that I couldn't hear to one of the officers who was with him, and then he led me into his office. "Sit down, Will," the chief said, taking his own advice opposite me. After I was comfortably seated, he began. "Now, do you mind if I record this conversation?" "No, sir." "Good. Now, originally, I was simply going to ask you to identify an individual we had in custody, but in light of recent events, I must ask you, what exactly happened that night?" I thought for a moment. Should I tell him the truth and risk sounding like a lunatic? But if I didn't tell the truth, then it was possible that more people could die due to my withholding of information. So instead, I decided to feel out what the chief was willing to believe. "What, if you don't mind me asking, are the recent events that have changed your agenda, sir?" I asked him. The chief responded by pulling out an MP3 player and handing it to me. The single audio file on the device was Michael O'Reilly's account of his venture into the woods. "So, you believe him then?" I asked once the file had finished playing. "Will, we aren't here to discuss what I do or do not believe in. We are here to catch a killer." "Sir, please, just answer this one question and I will tell you everything you need to know." Birmingham sighed and leaned back in his chair. "To be honest, son, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. After you boys found Brian's last words, I thought it was just a hallucination. Once we found Richard's recording, our expert told me that it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy type of situation, where you saw Brian's hallucination because of the trauma mixed in with the suggestion of the occult. But now, with Mr. O'Reilly's testimony, I'm starting to think that the psychic hallucination theory could just be a bunch of doctor-speak horseshit." I nodded, convinced that I could speak freely, without fear of being thought of as crazy. So, I told the chief my story, minus the part about how I summoned the creature. Birmingham listened attentively, and while he seemed slightly skeptical at first, towards the end he looked more resigned to the truth. When I was finished, he stood up and shook my hand over the desk. "Thank you, Will. I know it must have been hard, reliving that experience. Now, if you wouldn't mind staying here for a small while, we'll bring Alex in, and you can identify him for us." "You don't have him in custody?" I asked. "We did bring him down to the station, but we can only hold people here for so long without probable cause," the chief responded. I was about to confirm that I was willing to stay to identify that Alex was, in fact, the person who broke into Richard's house, when another officer burst into the room. "Chief, we got a problem. Officer Skips went missing in the northern woods, searching for the killer." God, why couldn't she have listened to me when I told her to take the goddamn week off? Birmingham shouted, slamming the desk with his fist. "Well, sir, you know about her personal attachment to this case, and I know very well how she feels about these murders, Jerry, and that's exactly why I told her to stay out of it," The chief followed the officer out of his office, but paused at the door to speak with me. Sorry, son. It looks like we won't be able to bring Alex in today after all. Would you mind if I give you a call when we're ready to have you come back? He asked politely. Of course not, sir, I responded, shaking my head. Thank you, Will. I assume you know the way out, Birmingham said promptly and left, yelling at his officers to get a search party ready. I noticed that the chief had left the MP3 player on the desk, so I grabbed it and walked out of the station to my car. I was about to begin the drive home when I stopped, engine idling in the parking lot. Recounting that night had made me remember something that had previously slipped my mind. Alex knew. He knew I had summoned the monster. The only question was, how? The chief had said that Alex was released, and since school was out, I figured the guy would probably be at his house. So, that's where I went when I finally pulled out of the parking lot. Luckily, Alex had thrown so many house parties over the years that even I knew his address. A few minutes later, I pulled into his house, and as I was walking up the stairs, the door opened. Hi, Will. I've been waiting for you to come in. Alex sounded nothing like himself. He sounded defeated, resigned to his fate. I accepted the invitation and stepped through the doorway into the living room. Alex motioned for me to sit across from him, and once I did, he began to speak. I knew this would happen. Ever since I burst through that window, just please make it quick, Alex said, his head bowed in regret. Make it quick? What are you talking about, Alex? I responded, stunned at his words. You're not here to kill me? He asked, taking his head out of his hands. No, why would you think that? I replied. Because you summoned a goddamn demon and had it kill everyone, Alex shouted, then flinched. You think I meant to summon Et Qui Audit? I said, taken aback. Don't say its name, Alex responded fearfully in a hoarse whisper. Sorry, I replied. But, Alex, I didn't want to summon it. I performed the ritual, but I didn't think it would work. Alex just sat there, eyes blank, seeming to take all this in. I guess that explains why you looked so surprised to see me both those times, he said. Yeah, that's actually what I came here to ask you about, I stated. How could you have known that I summoned the monster? Well, that's kind of a long story, Alex replied. Trust me, I have the time, I said. Okay. Well, it was a few weeks ago when it happened. I was in my room one night and there was a tapping at the door. No one else was home, so I went to go see who it was. But when I opened the front door, no one was there. So, I trudged back downstairs, annoyed that someone had gotten me off my gaming chair. Just as I reached the bottom, the tapping began again. I yelled up, "You better not be messing with me, or else you're gonna get it," and grabbed my BB gun before stomping back up. Alex paused and shuddered horribly before continuing. Before I could get to the door, however, the tapping began coming from the walls too, and it started getting louder. I began to get scared, but I figured if this was still a prank, then I couldn't show how well it was working. So I carefully began walking toward the door, BB gun loaded. I threw open the door for a second time, to once again find nothing. I started to slowly close the door, BB gun still pointed out into the crushing darkness, when a hand shot out and wrapped its fingers around the edge. I screamed at this point, and stumbled back away from the open doorway, firing blindly into the darkness. I must have missed, because an arm slowly pulled itself into view, along with a second hand, and soon the whole body. He broke down crying then. I had no idea what to do. I hadn't thought that Alex was even capable of fear, much less minor hysteria. I reached across the table to put my hand on his shoulder, but Alex shrugged me off. I'm fine. Alex said, shaking himself and drying his eyes. I assume you know what it looks like? I nodded in response. Good. I don't want to ever see it in my mind ever again. Anyways, after I saw it, I screamed, and the monster slammed me up against the wall, dug its nails into my throat, and said, Will, that voice, it was the most horrible sound I have ever heard in my life. Then it attacked me. Not like a physical attack, no, it was more of a mental stab. I nodded and told Alex I knew exactly what he meant. Okay, well, it was able to take control of me, and without my consent, I began walking towards the nearest house. Brian's house. I swear, I didn't want to do it, but the thing made me. I began tapping at his door, and the noise multiplied. I heard Brian run upstairs. Don't ask me how, but when the monster had me, I could hear everything. Tiny whispers, far-off ants, even heartbeats. So I broke in and followed him upstairs. And then well, you read what Brian said. You know, don't you? I swear, Will, I had no control whatsoever. But after it made me kill, I fought back as hard as I could. I struggled with it, but it still forced me to break down the door and lean over Brian. He woke up and began breathing loudly. Then the thing put my finger to Brian's mouth and used my mouth to say those damn words. Then the demon began pouring its energy. I don't know what it was, but Will, it was killing Brian. I could feel his life slipping away, but with its energy focused on Brian, I was able to get control again, and I bolted out of the house, taking the monster with me. A week later, though, it came back, and it made me finish the job. I think after it made its first kill, it didn't need to use me anymore, because the thing hasn't possessed me since, and, well, you know what I did after that. Alex fell silent then, burying his head back in between his fingers. But Brian said that he saw Et Qui Audit himself. I replied, confused. Maybe possession isn't right. It took over me somehow, like as the monster took my mind, my body changed as well, Alex said through his fingers. Well, whatever happened, it wasn't your fault, Alex. It was mine, I told him, reaching out to pat Alex on the back. Thank you, Will. That's all I've ever wanted to hear since it happened. Alex choked out through sobs. Someone to finally believe me that I didn't do it. After Alex stopped crying, we sat there in complete silence for a while. So, what do we do now? I asked Alex. I hadn't thought past finding out what he had done. Isn't it obvious? He replied. We have to kill it. But how can we do that? From what you've told me, Et Qui Audit can just possess you at will, and I can barely hold the damn monster off, I stated hopelessly. He can possess me at will, Alex said, seeming to ponder that idea. After a few minutes, he began to speak again. Okay, I think I have an idea. When I was possessed, my sense of hearing was heightened a lot, but my ears were also a lot more sensitive. I remember one of them touched a door frame, and it felt as if I'd been slapped across the face. So you're saying we cripple it by attacking its ears? I asked disbelievingly. Well, you said you can hold it off, right? So if you get it to focus on attacking you, and I sneak up from behind and slash its ears, then yeah, I guess that is pretty much the plan. I thought about that for a minute. We didn't have many options at this point, and a bad plan was still better than no plan. All right, I guess we don't have much choice, do we? I replied. We then prepared ourselves to fight what had nearly killed us both. Alex grabbed a large butterfly knife and gave me a small kitchen one, just in case. After that, we got into Alex's car, and he drove us to what was once Richard's house. The cave that it lives in is somewhere in these woods, Alex told me. We trekked through the trees and came across the clearing where my friends first ran into the monster, and where Zach was murdered. My mind began to flash back to that awful night. The screams, the terror, the monster. Alex shocked me out of it by grabbing my hand and pointing to horribly misshapen footprints. We followed the tracks until we came upon the cave. There was something horribly wrong with the entrance, though. Light shined through the trees and allowed us to see perfectly. But as soon as the light struck the cave, it was as if it had hit a solid wall of darkness. I almost turned around right there, but Alex put a hand on my back as if to reassure me. His presence reminded me that if we didn't stop it, the monster would continue killing until we were the only two left in this town. I knew we had to try. We plunged into darkness. I went first with my phone's flashlight lighting the way. Alex just a few feet behind me. No flashlight, as to disguise his presence. The further we went, the more the darkness closed around my small beacon of light, and the more my nose began to fill with the sickly scent of death. My steps became slower and slower, the farther we trudged down into that tunnel. I was afraid to find what I knew I would sooner or later, by stumbling across Richard's body. Just as I started to think that this might not be the same cave that Michael had described to the police, I heard a crunch under my foot. I looked down and recognized Richard's phone. It was cracked and broken, but I would know his case anywhere. It was a picture of Slender Man looking over an unaware child. I picked up the phone and reluctantly scanned the ground with my flashlight for the body. But my friend's corpse was nowhere to be found. I began to walk once again, my fear growing with every step, as I realized that if his body wasn't there, something had to have moved it. Those were the thoughts in my head as the tunnel finally started to flatten out. The Et Qui Audit must have moved poor Richard's corpse. But to where and why? Possibly for nourishment? The thought alone made me want to spill my guts over the stone wall. By this point, my flashlight was barely a pinprick in the darkness. I had to shine it around the floor and walls, just to make sure I didn't trip or fall. Then, all of a sudden, the walls were no longer there. I frantically panned my light all around, and I saw that the tunnel had opened itself into a large circular room. Unlike the walls and ground of the tunnel, the surfaces of this room were smooth. I took a step further, and my light began to illuminate the back wall. I honestly wish I had remained innocent as to what happened to Richard's body. He was propped up on a stool, his mangled hand strapped to a pink teacup. The rotting flesh of his lower face was stretched into an ungodly smile. It was then that the full effect of the smell hit me. I fell to my knees and started to cry. What this monster had done to my poor Richard was vile.
"Don't be scared,"
a voice said from the darkness.
"He won't hurt you."
My blood turned to ice, and my body froze with fear. I tried to force my limbs to move, to find the source of the noise, to do anything, but they wouldn't respond. Then I saw a small light appear from the darkness. A candle. And in that light, I saw a small girl.
"Mr. Ellyman likes you, Will,"
Lucy told me. Lucy? I said. I thought Et Qui Audit had killed you.
I have never touched even a single hair on any innocent child's head.
The words rang out in my mind, and from her face, I knew Lucy could hear it too.
The girl is right, however. I did not wish to kill you, as you gave me new life again. But now you've come here to end that life, haven't you, Alex?
Et Qui Audit said, as it stepped into the light of Lucy's candle. It was then that I knew we wouldn't make it out of this alive. The monster knew what we were going to try.
Did you really think that you could kill me? I am suffering incarnate. I hear all and know all. Just as I know that you both shall now die.
It lunged its hand, stretching towards my neck. The monster's fingers closed around me and it squeezed, crushing my windpipe. I felt Alex lunge with his knife, but Et Qui Audit lashed out with its other hand and began to strangle him as well.
Soon all will be quiet,
the monster said aloud to us, and I felt its mind begin to invade mine. I fought back with everything I had, but it was too powerful. The mind was its domain. I looked over at Alex and struggled out the words,
sorry.
Then I heard a click and a scream. Alex had ejected the blade of his knife right into Et Qui Audit's ear. The creature threw me across the room and clawed Alex's face with its now free hand. I sucked in a full breath and pulled out my own knife to attack the monster. But before I could take a single step, my mind was under assault once again by Et Qui Audit. It quickly invaded my consciousness and locked my limbs in place. Alex began trying to beat at the monster, but the creature stopped his movement too. I fought my paralysis with everything I possibly could. Instead of trying to force Et Qui Audit out of my own head, I began to invade its mind. The monster's hand stopped, its nails buried in Alex's flesh. And then I felt a mental wave like a tsunami force me out of Et Qui Audit's mind and back into my own. But the presence of the thing inside my own head had lessened. I started to force my limbs to move. It felt like I had an anvil strapped to each of my extremities, but at least I was able to take a step. Et Qui Audit plunged its nails inside Alex's eye sockets, and he shrieked out in pain. I had never heard such a raw expression of human agony in my life, and I hope I never will again. As Alex's eyes were pulled from his head, I reached the monster's back. Slowly, having to fight for every inch, I pulled my knife back and thrust it down, through Et Qui Audit's back, and out its chest, right where its heart should be. I suddenly no longer had to fight to move my own body. Et Qui Audit's presence was gone. Its body tumbled to the floor, and Alex collapsed. We'd done it. The monster was dead. I ran to Alex, who wasn't breathing, and began performing CPR. He sucked in a large gasp of breath, and his eyelids snapped open. Alex's sockets were a mess of blood, other unidentifiable pieces of red. "Will," he said urgently. "Will, you have to listen." "It's all right, Alex. It's all right. It's dead. Et Qui Audit is dead," I responded. "No, Will. It isn't dead. It's taking me." Alex gasped. "What do you mean, Alex? Its body is right there," I replied, shoving my finger in its direction. "No, Will. It isn't dead. It's possessing me like you said, but this time it's for good. It's killing me and taking my body as its own." As Alex said this, his mouth began to stretch, slicing longer than humanly possible, as blood began to pour from his now open cuts. His ears looked bigger than they were before, and his arms longer. "No, Alex, this isn't what we planned!" I yelled in anger and despair. "Will," Alex said, putting his hand on my face. "This was always the plan. I knew I would never be able to keep it from taking my mind, but you can keep it from taking my body." "Alex, what are you saying?" I asked. "Kill me, Will. It's the only way." "Alex, I can't kill you. There has to be some way to force it out." "Will, there is no way to force it out, and if you don't do this now,
Et Qui Audit haunt this place forever."
I knew he was right. Even his voice didn't sound like his own anymore. It sounded hoarse and evil. I started to cry as I picked up his discarded blade in my hand. The sharp edge cut into me, and I started to bleed. I raised the blade and looked into what was left of Alex's eyes. He nodded once, and I plunged the blade into his heart. Alex's mouth opened in a silent scream. A shadow emerged from his mouth and rushed towards me. I threw up a wall around my mind, and I felt Et Qui Audit pound against it, trying to take me over the same way it took over Alex. I felt the pounding both in and outside my head, and I fell to the ground in pain. I screamed out and attacked Et Qui Audit again, and the shadow got thrown away. Then it rushed towards Lucy. I yelled for her to run, to hide, or anything, but Lucy just stood there, and the shadow just flitted around the candle. It never touched Lucy. And after a minute of her standing stock still and me writhing in pain, the shadow faded. And I heard the last gasp of breath from Et Qui Audit's body. The minutes that followed Alex's death were a blur. Lucy led me back up the tunnel and to the road where we contacted the police. As the sirens of cop cars and the ambulance got closer, I passed out. I woke up once again in the hospital. This time, however, my parents weren't sitting by my bed. My hand that had been sliced open was now covered in a thick layer of gauze. I felt bruised all over, and broken in more ways than one. But I was alive. I was beginning to wonder if anyone would ever come and tell me what had happened in the last few hours when Chief Birmingham burst through the door. I moved to this goddamn town to try to get away from the big city hustle and bustle. Irony sure does bite you in the ass, doesn't it, Will? He said. I didn't respond. I just stared back at him. Your parents are okay, if that's what you're wondering. I just wanted to ask you a few questions before they got the chance to talk to you. All right, I replied, my mind too blurry to comprehend why. What exactly happened yesterday, after you left my office? Birmingham asked. I told him everything, from my decision to see Alex up to the death of Et Qui Audit. The chief was a good listener. Occasionally he took notes or stopped me to clarify something, but mostly he just sat and nodded. A good hour had passed by the time I was finished, and Birmingham stood. Well, Will, it sure seems like you've been through more in the past week than most go through in a lifetime. The reason I needed to know was because Alex was found dead in that cave, and you were a possible suspect. But your story matched with Lucy's to a T, and I'm fairly sure no prosecutor will charge you. I'm going to try to keep you from having to retell your account as much as possible. However, I'm fairly sure some black-suited people will come and question you no matter what I say. Thank you, sir, I said. Would it be okay if I asked what happened to Lucy down there? Son, it's not my place. But for now, let's just say the girl suffered her own horrors down there that she will carry for years to come. I nodded in agreement. Birmingham left and was about to close the door when he said, Oh, and Will, we searched your belongings and found that recording of Michael Bridge. We were going to have to confiscate it, but he said that it's yours to do with what you wish. So, take from that what you will. And with that, the chief was gone. And now, I am alone. It's been 4 days since Et Qui Audit's death, and I've stayed locked in my room for the entire time. I haven't spoken to either Michael or Lucy, but his wife did thank me for what I did. I lost all my friends to the dark abyss, and there was no one to blame but myself. I called the monster. I got Brian killed, Aunt Lucy kidnapped. I stabbed Alex. And nothing will ever be the same. For now, I'm posting this along with Michael's account to the same thread that the other stories have been collected on. I'm not going to tell you to not look for things you shouldn't, or not to mess with the arcane or occult. I know my warning wouldn't stop anyone anyways. It didn't stop me. The only thing I will tell you is that if you do decide to perform a ritual you read in a book or saw on the internet, you better be damn well sure that you're prepared to be heard.
Well, that's the end of Quiet. I want to thank you all for watching till the end of this series, and if this is the first video you watched, probably didn't make much sense, so you should go watch the others. It's enough sellout. I haven't really done one of these before, so I'm just gonna kind of talk. I want to thank my friends who supported me, and particularly one who kept trying to nag me about when the next one was coming out, and it was a little bit of a pain, but it we probably wouldn't be finished today if they didn't do that. So thank you, you know who you are. I'd like to thank you to one of my other friends who edited my stories. Once again, you know who you are. I'll link her channel down in the description. Yeah, so thank you all for watching, and and if you liked the character of Will, I'm thinking of writing another series, I guess you call it, on him, and once he's grown up, and he becomes a PI, paranormal investigator, personal investigator. And if he didn't, then oh well, it might not come out anyways. And I hope you liked the ending, the final story. Once again, if you didn't, I can't really blame you there. It kind of went off the rails for it went much more into the realm of the supernatural than I had done before, and I don't know, it was fun, and it helped explain a lot of things, and I tried to keep it as, believable as possible, if not realistic, which it obviously isn't. But yeah, so that's the end. Hope you all liked it. Thank you for watching.